Shen is a champion who can fit into almost any team composition, and that's directly because of the fact that he is incredibly flexible. He does good damage, he's also a very strong tank, and he brings CC to the board. There is very little that Shen doesn't offer. But one of the direct flaws from being able to do so many things relatively well is that it's very difficult to manage all of them at the same time. And the most obvious example that I can give you is when you're trying to play Shen, microing him in lane, and then all of a sudden you need to react to something that's happening around the map with his ultimate, which is his global shield that teleports him to allies and allows him to get to almost any fight. Now, I'm not going to be able to tell you every single tiny detail about Shen, but what I can give you here is a lot of the things that make Shen tick. The stuff that's super important to both do and avoid on him to make sure that you're maximizing your potential. To find videos that have a very specific focus on certain aspects of Shen, you should definitely go check out our website, and also go check it out if you're just trying to improve in League in general. We have tons of guides that are all made by challenger level players on just about any topic. While you're watching, if you happen to learn something new, make sure you hit the like button and let me know what it was. That way I can actually know if this video is useful to you guys. And if you have anything else to share that you think I missed or find important for new or old Shen players coming alike, make sure you share that as well. And while you're commenting, you may as well subscribe. That way you can keep up with the other stuff that we're releasing on the patch or other champions. Now's the time to jump into the nitty-gritty on Shen though. And here we're going to separate it into the different phases of the game. That way I can group things together to give you a better explanation of how you should be looking to play Shen throughout the whole game. So starting with the early game, and very specifically the level 1, if you aren't leashing on Shen, doing a very small thing can completely change the course of your lane. If you aren't leashing, walk up into your lane and pull your Spirit Blade to you. Just in case you don't know, if you pull Shen's Q through an enemy champion, it gets empowered, so that it basically doubles the damage and gives you a ton of bonus attack speed. Having the ability to walk up in the lane and place the Q behind where the enemy minions are going to be allows you to position for a fantastic Q at level 1, which can totally chunk somebody out of lane. It can very easily force somebody to use a health potion or back off from the wave completely and zone them from CS, and that's right at level 1. And doing this makes a drastic difference. If you have to leash for your ally, of course, you should go do that instead. The range of your Spirit Blade isn't big enough to where you can pull it into lane and then not have it come towards you as you walk over to the camp to leash your jungler. That's why you can only do this if you aren't leashing, so just keep that in mind. Once you really start to get to playing out the lane and you start gaining levels, there's a few things that you need to keep track of. One is your passive shield. Way too often, people make the mistake of going in and going for a trade without their passive shield being up. And that's just simply a mistake in every sense of the word. You're losing out on 70 plus shielding constantly in trades that you're going over. You are putting yourself at a huge disadvantage if you're doing that. Make sure you keep track of the cooldown and be cognizant of when you're using your abilities, because you could sneak things in and make things a little bit closer time than you might think, as Shen's Q will shield him once it gets to him, not when you cast it. Similarly, his E, once he finishes the dash, that's when it checks his passive cooldown and applies it if it's actually up. For the W, it's the same thing. You get the shield after the W expires. Keeping track of how these things work with his passive and working it in lane as the cooldown is coming up is very, very crucial to managing Shen's health bar throughout the entire lane. In general, whenever you're going up for CS that you think you're going to be poked for or going for a trade, you shouldn't be doing it unless you have your passive. Please do yourself a favor and avoid taking damage when you don't have your passive as much as you possibly can. Shen is a lane bully in the sense that usually he could come out on top in most trades, but if you try to trade too quickly, you're not going to be utilizing your passive, and therefore people will have the chance to beat you out. Shen is the one who is supposed to be oppressive in the lane that he's playing in. At least that's what it would be ideally. You know, there are exceptions where enemies are cheating by playing ranged top laners, and the few champions that actually manage to trade back into Shen due to some really powerful abilities in their kit. But for the most part, you shouldn't have problems with anybody in the lane. But let's say you're in the worst position possible and you actually are against somebody who can rough up Shen in the early game. What do you do then? Well, firstly, you should recognize that you, as a champion who is extremely tanky, do scale really, really well into your first item. Specifically, you scale well enough that you can beat them in an outright fight. Because you might be getting zoned or pushed around in places that you really don't want to, you probably aren't getting many empowered Qs off unless the enemy pushes the lane into you. And this is a key factor to playing Shen into bad matchups. You want to allow your opponent to start to come towards you and push towards your tower, and then try and maintain a freeze so that you can use your Spirit Blade to actually get really insane trades, because when you drag it through somebody, they get slowed while walking away from you, which effectively forces them to do something about you as you approach them. Let's also not forget that League of Legends is not a 1v1 game, and junglers are very real, even if they usually don't seem to end up at the top lane island resort. But a gank from a jungler, a roam from a mid laner, or even a roam from a support can really set up Shen to kill somebody who's overextending because he's put them into a freeze that's really tough for them to break. At the end of the day, even if you force somebody to just simply use all their abilities or spend a lot of time overextending, you're generating pressure, which is exactly what somebody like Shen should be doing at all times that he possibly can. There's a couple other factors that you need to be considering in the early game as well on Shen, mostly around your ability usage in your W and your E, as well as what you use your runes for. It might seem kind of obvious to say wait until you have your Q and your grasp up to trade with your opponent, and of course if you have your passive up, that would be the perfect ideal scenario if you drag your Q through the enemy. But it can feel really tempting when you just have a normal Q and your grasp up with no shield to try and go smack the opponent. Don't do this. Please do not do this. This is you just baiting yourself because you feel like you're strong, but you're missing out on your shield and you're missing out on the empowered Q. You really need to ask yourself, is it really worth it to get this one auto attack in on my opponent when they have other abilities that they could use against me to trade back? And chances are, 95% of the time, it is not going to be worth it. You don't want to feel forced to use your W to block a single auto attack. You want to make sure that you're using it when your opponent commits to you. And so doing something like going up for a Q grasp proc on a normal Q can sometimes feel like you're forced to use a W to get a better trade-off. And that's exactly what you shouldn't be doing, because you aren't blocking important things like a Jackson power, a Darius W, a Nasus Q, whatever it might be. You need to make sure that that's what you're looking out for, rather than playing a trade wrong in the first place and wasting your abilities. Similarly with Shen E, you can use Shen E to go in and get your Q through somebody if you play it right, but consider the fact that once you dash in, there's really nothing that can allow you to get out other than, your legs. And if the enemy has slows, ways to chase you down, kite you repeatedly, and you go in and you can't actually win, you're dead, or you're gonna be so low that you can no longer lane. You need to weigh the risks of using this ability properly, and it can be really hard, especially if you haven't yet grasped the idea of using Grasp of the Undying plus Shen passive plus Shen Q properly. The very last thing that I'll mention about the laning phase is something that you can consider, let's say, standard on Shen whenever you're trying to go after somebody in your lane. Usually you're going to want to reposition your Q by walking up into the lane and using your passive to mitigate whatever damage the enemy throws at you, and place your Q in a nice spot so that you can drag it through the person the next time. Because the duration of your Q buff is actually really long, almost as long as your passive, it's okay to take a little bit of damage and then reposition to pull the next Q into your opponent, but you don't want to use it right after the cooldown comes up. You want to wait a little bit and try and get some value by using the auto attack from your already empowered Q, and then drag it through your opponent to maximize the amount of empowered auto attacks you have in a given period of time. When done correctly, you can even get your shield off again as you pull the Q through your opponent, because anytime one of your abilities affects an enemy champion, the cooldown of your passive is reduced. Getting this off is something that's very fundamental to playing Shen in the laning phase, as you will repeatedly be shielding damage from your opponent and poking them with Grasp, with Q, empowered Qs, and all the other things that you have stacking in your favor, which of course we'll go over in the runes and item sections at the end of the video. Shen just completely changes when he hits level 6, because now you have a new goal that you need to keep track of in the back of your mind at all times. Your R is simultaneously one of the best engaging tools and one of the best defensive tools in the game, because it's a massive shield that also brings you to the ally you're shielding, which can allow you to make aggressive plays by following up on other allies who are going in, or reacting to somebody getting all in and shielding them, saving them, and killing somebody because of it. You always need to be keeping track of your allies' health bars where they're displayed above the minimap. If you happen to have the setting changed, then it's going to show on the left side of your screen. But no matter where you have that set up, you need to pay attention, because that can be the fastest indicator that something's going on the map that you need to take a look at. And I don't mean that you should just blindly ulti somebody as their health bar gets low on the indicator above your minimap. I mean you need to look at them. Look at their champion, pan your screen over. You could do this by clicking on the minimap, by double clicking on the picture that's above the minimap. You could do it by using F keys. I don't care what you use. If you have it bound to your numpad, sure, that's great. Take your hands off the mouse, whatever. But you need to be looking at this, because you need to make the decision on whether or not your ultimate is actually necessary. Wasting a Shen ultimate is one of the worst things that you could ever do, even worse than the voice crack I just had. Shen's ultimate at rank 1 is 3 minutes and 20 seconds cooldown. That is absurd, and not being able to participate in fights because you had to burn both your ultimate and your TP to return back to lane in the same time, so that now you can't really do anything outside of your own lane for 3+ minutes, is one of the most crippling things that you could ever have happen to you. This is precisely why you need to make sure that your ultimate is going to count. And it's one of the most fundamental skills on Shen, other than learning how to fully abuse his Q in the lane. Simply learning how to correctly use Shen's ultimate is going to be something that sticks with you from level 6 all the way to level 18, no matter what game time you're looking at and what game state you're looking at, because it almost always has a use. And if you played Shen right in the early game, then you should actually have a pretty sizable lead on your own, whether it be in levels, gold, or maybe even both. You showing up with a shield isn't just you shielding your ally, never forget that. You can turn the course of a fight by taunting somebody or taunting multiple people and getting big damage off by pulling your Q through people and utilizing all the items and other leads that you have from your lane. In the mid game, even though it's a long cooldown, you should be looking to make plays with your ultimate as often as you possibly can. And I mean, that's not as often as you might like, as we did say earlier, it has a 3-minute cooldown, but that's just why you gotta make every single one count. And when it's down, don't let that discourage you. You can still make plays into the side lane that you're playing onto when you don't have your ultimate up, even by yourself. You don't even need allies at that point, because you should be stronger than your opponent thanks to your plays that you make across the map and thanks to your early game. Who knows, maybe the stars aligned and you didn't actually need to use your teleport to get back to lane quickly. In that case, you might be able to use your teleport in the downtime of your R. But one thing that you need to make sure that you aren't doing is staying away from golden experience in the side lane for too long. You can do what I just said and teleport to a fight after having used your R just, a minute and a half ago. But if you're doing that, keep in mind how that sets you behind from your opponent that you're split pushing against. Shen scales really hard with levels because of how his cooldown of his R decreases and how his R shield increases by a large amount. Even just ignoring the utility of all of his other cooldowns being lowered and the way that they scale with his maximum health, and even in some ways scaling directly through item effects, you have a really massive reason to keep up on your side lane pressure for solo leveling, for solo gold, and of course, getting the ability to impact the map up more often and more powerfully. If you mess up and you aren't actually maximizing your resource intake, you will notice that in the later stages of the game, you start to fall off really quickly. Without being able to taunt people more often, block auto attacks more often, have certain unique passives that change how Shen can play in team fights, and anything else that you could possibly think of gold or experience giving you benefits from, you are going to get destroyed in a side lane 1v1. That's why in the late game, your goal is to maintain the golden experience lead that you have for as long as you possibly can. That way you can continue to pressure people who show up in your side lane. And then when the time is right, you can pull your ultimate across the map to make a game-winning play, securing an Elder Dragon, securing a Dragon Soul, securing a Baron, whatever it might be. It could even be just diving into the enemy's inhibitor tower and killing the entire enemy team except for the person who was split pushing against you. That's a viable way to win the game. And Shen is a champion who can enable his allies to do that while protecting their flanks, literally in the sense of protecting towers and lanes that other people are trying to destroy while your teammates are busy. If you happen to be in a really fantastic spot in the mid and even transitioning into the later stages of the game, depending on your matchup, you can even turn this pressure onto the enemy team, being strong enough to split push on your own and get away from bad scenarios due to your constant shielding and decent mobility. You can simultaneously push on top of the enemy top inhibitor while allowing your allies to do something in the bot lane where you can still show up if you're needed with your ultimate. And even if somebody does come over to stop you, just hitting R on somebody who's starting to take some damage can easily give them over 600 shielding. And I mean right there, that's already better than a Phantom Dancer shield, which when you think about it is actually ridiculous. Sometimes though, even with the lead that you might have and the lead that you'll be giving your teammates thanks to your presence in the early and mid game with your R, the enemy team can get to a point where they simply have too much power, too much engage in order for your team to stop them and actually give you time to hit R and show up to a fight. If that's the case, then don't make the mistake of trying to split push. You might just need to stick with your team. Remember, Shen is a big body. You have easy access to shielding, decent mobility, a way to block auto attacks, and a way to shield allies. Having all of these in close proximity and an easy access can really make the difference for your team, because you might be the only thing that's standing in the way of the enemy Malphite from getting a 3-man ultimate on your backline. Even if you don't manage to stop him and he gets to go in on you and your entire team, you can still react by pulling your Spirit Blade to you and using your W immediately, protecting you and any surrounding allies who got hit by the Malphite from any of the enemy team's auto attack follow-up, and that can be the difference that wins you a fight. Better yet, you manage to avoid the Malphite ulti and instead go in and taunt several people on the enemy team who are trying to wombo combo or just follow up on your team. And having that one crucial taunt where you also chunk somebody because you get a free Spirit Blade drag and start synergizing with the other effects that you have in your items and runes available to you, you can easily turn the tides. And while I'm giving specific examples on like, oh, a Malphite engage that you can counter the follow-up from, don't take that for granted. That's something that's really common in League. The enemy Kled ulting into your team. That's pretty simple to what a Malphite is trying to accomplish, and Orianna getting a sick ulti off that her allies can maybe follow up on. You can stop that follow-up as well there. These sorts of ultis and engages and styles of play exist through a ton of different team comps and champions on their own. So don't even think for 1 second that this isn't applicable to your game. Trust me, it is, in one way or another. Now that we've covered your goals, playstyle, techniques, and other things that you should be looking to do in the game throughout all the stages, let's move on to the actual technical setup and talk about runes and items. And first, let's go for the runes. As Shen, you should always be taking Grasp. It's simply so powerful for him, as it offers healing, extra damage, and the rest of the resolve tree, which is a big deal, because Shen has synergy with several of the other runes here. And that starts right off the bat with Shield Bash. You as Shen have a 10-second cooldown shield that can be even lower if you're hitting your abilities properly. And so when you have access to that sort of repeated shielding, you can very easily start to rack up a ton of damage with your Shield Bash. And it of course makes you tankier for the duration of the shield, which allows you to absorb more damage. And that's important because you want to maximize the effectiveness of your shielding. Stack this with Grasp and you have an even more powerful trade. In the next row of the resolve tree, you should be taking Revitalize pretty much every time. While conditioning might seem nice for the extra resistances and bone plating could seem useful in certain matchups, in reality, Shen doesn't have any healing other than his Grasp. And getting even just a little bit to stack on top of something like a Doran's Shield or a Rejuve Bee that's going to be built into a Tiamat later on can make a big difference in your sustain over the course of a long laning period. This gets even better when you think about the fact that your shield is going to mitigate a large amount of damage that you're taking, and even if you get to regenerate just some of the small amount of health that you have missing, it's worth it over time, because the shield will block most and the regeneration makes up for the rest. Lastly, you have a similar scenario when you're looking at Overgrowth and Revitalize. Overgrowth seems good, but it is pretty greedy and it really only has one use to make you a little bit tankier. The health gain actually isn't that much, and considering the gains that you get from repeatedly increasing your shielding from your passive and increasing the shielding from your R is way more powerful than the small health gains over the whole game that Overgrowth will give you. Because the bonus also increases when you're lower health, you get even more clutch potential, as even just a slightly stronger shield can be the difference between you winning or losing at that very razor's edge fight. In terms of secondary runes, you do have a few options, but there is one that, at least to me, stands out as being the best, but I will cover them all just to make sure that you know every option that you have available to you. The shining star here is taking Domination secondary and going Cheap Shot and Ravenous Hunter. Shen actually does a lot of damage with his Spirit Blade, and because of that, the healing you get from Ravenous Hunter is not something that you should ignore. It can actually be really powerful. And if you know that you're going for a build that has very little cooldown reduction, you can even instead go for Ultimate Hunter, which can allow you to get more ultimates off in the game, which can lead to really big clutches where you manage to barely shield people in time. Something that really doesn't get enough credit though is Cheap Shot. As keep in mind that anytime you drag your Q through somebody, they get slowed, which means that you can proc Cheap Shot on them. A really good way to notice if you're actually playing Shen properly is to look at your numbers on Cheap Shot and Shield Bash throughout the laning phase. If you're playing things absolutely optimally, the numbers that those are dealing should be roughly the same, and you could easily get them above 1,000 throughout a single game. Remember, the cooldown is 4 seconds, and the cooldown of your Q is 5 at max rank. This also works on your E, as it counts as an immobilization effect for the purposes of Cheap Shot, and if you're buying something like a Randuin's or even a Deadman's that have the ability to proc slows on people, you can also get the effect triggering there. It's really simple to use because it fits straight into Shen's normal optimal playstyle, which is exactly why you can use it so much and why you should use it a lot. But if you aren't into taking Domination secondary for whatever reason, you could also go Inspiration, as you might want to take something that's a bit more creative and interesting like Hex Flash and Cosmic Insight to give you more cooldown reduction overall for your crucial abilities like your ultimate, and also giving you interesting new angles at which you can approach fights. While Shen isn't necessarily known as being an amazing engager, having Hex Flash can allow you to surprise a lot of people and get some very unique engages. Considering that this does really nothing for your early laning though, it does have its weaknesses there, in the sense that it's not going to benefit you as much as Cheap Shot's trading damage will, Ravenous Hunter's sustain will, or even to a certain extent, Ultimate Hunter's cooldown would. In terms of the minor runes, keep in mind that you are somebody who should be, for the most part, winning lanes in the early game, and because of that you want to take things that allow you to oppress people more. Usually that ends up being attack speed, adaptive, and either armor or MR depending on your matchup, but you could technically go double adaptive if you realize that you're not going to be getting into many extended trades with people where the attack speed isn't useful, or you could even go double defensive where you go double armor, double MR, or maybe even just one of each. These are pretty easy to adapt on the fly, and so you definitely should. While the runes have a bit of leeway, the items are where things get a little bit more rigid, as Shen does have a pretty steady power curve that you want to stick to with his current item build. Realistically, you should be starting either a Doran Shield or a Ruby Crystal every game. Most of the time it's going to be Doran Shield. The only time you would ever start Ruby Crystal is when you really want to get into your other items quickly and you don't need the extra sustain that Doran Shield gives, but keep in mind that that is kind of rare. From there, your goal should be to get another Ruby Crystal or just have 2 in general, and then buy a Tiamat. And this is because Shen wants to get Titanic Hydra as his first item, and getting the health early on will allow him to scale in his tankiness at least enough to keep up with other people in the lane, as he might seem a bit squishier than most. But that just means that you aren't utilizing your shielding and your abilities to their maximum potential. The payoff is really when you get Titanic Hydra, where at any point, if you ever land a Q on somebody, you can easily chunk them out for a ton of HP. One Shen empowered Q can allow him to get another auto attack in, which has a ton of percentage health damage, and then follow up with an immediate Titanic Hydra auto attack reset, which gives him 2 of his Q auto attacks really quickly. So fast that most people don't get to really retaliate, because he can either use his W, his E, or just walk away if he's fast enough. And if you happen to be playing against those cheaters who are playing squishy range champions in the top lane, if at this point you manage to land a taunt on somebody, drag your Q through them, and give them an auto attack Titanic and another auto attack before the taunt expires, they're probably almost dead. That's just how well your damage scales with your levels and getting Titanic Hydra by the time roughly around when you have Q maxed or maybe a little bit afterwards. From there, you're really looking to just go defensive boots, either Tabby or Mertrez depending on the enemy team, as Shen doesn't really have a reason to go anything else. Cooldown boots might seem nice, but realistically, the amount of tankiness that you get from having something like Tabby's auto attack reduction can be huge, because sometimes your W just isn't enough. After your boots, you're just trying to identify who you need to actually build against on the enemy team. If you're looking to split push against somebody who is a really annoying threat that does magic damage, then buying something like a Wit's End can turn Shen into a really intense duelist who's still really tanky. If you're looking for something that's a bit more traditional though, you can go Sunfire Cape, which would give you really good damage anytime you manage to land your E. If you notice that your role isn't really to have some good damage in the side lane and you already have enough split pushing potential because of your Titanic, you can instead go for Randuin's or even a Deadman's depending on the enemy team comp. But let's say the enemy has some people who are building death stances or other lifesteal items, and so you need something like a thorn mail. What you should do is buy a bramble vest and sit on it as you complete other defensive itemization, because all you really need is the slight damage return and the grievous wounds effect. So with Titanic, let's say Merc Treads and then a bramble vest, what do you go from there? Well, you can go Adaptive Helm to counter enemy magic damage, or simply a Warmogs for raw HP and amazing health regen. When you're going into items that start to give you a lot of health and you really start to get good scalings because of it, now you can look to build more utility-based items that also scale with your health. A perfect example of this would be Locket, as most of the time, Shen is pretty good at surviving, and the real key is that he needs a little bit of assistance to help his allies survive, because they're going to be the main threat against the enemy team after he's exhausted his cooldowns and his energy. Going Titanic into Merc Treads, then Bramble Vest, Warmogs, the Locket of the Iron Solari would leave you at 5 items with an amazing teamfight presence that allows you to save many people from the brink of death, and not just through your ultimate, but also through your taunts and your Locket shielding. Since you don't really ever want to finish the Thorn Mail until it's the absolute last thing that you could buy, you would be looking for something else. You could buy another utility item like a Knight's Vow, or even something like a Zeke's. Even though you can't make use of the mana, the defensive stats are still great, and considering that it gives cooldown reduction and another effect that's really awesome whenever you use your ultimate, would be a good fit. If you're not forced into buying specific items like Bramble Vest against the enemy team, then you absolutely should be looking for items that can give you cooldown reduction, so you actually get to use your ultimate and play the game a bit more often and pressure the enemy team more. Spirit Visage, Adaptive Helm, Knight's Vow, Warmogs, and many other of those 10% tanky cooldown reduction items are amazing fits. And with that wrapping up the item section, that's just about everything that I can give you on Shen. And if you still want more, make sure you go check out our website where we have more on him, other champions, and just about anything that you could need in order to improve at League. And everything's done by challenger level players, so you know you're getting stuff from the best of the best. And as always, my name is Ace Windstorm, and I will see you all later.